That I'm confused between the difference of fard and wajib, and also sunnah muakkada and sunnah ghair muakkada. Can you please explain these terms to me?
وما أرسلنا من قبلك إلا رجالا نوحي إليهم فاسألوا أهل الذكر إن كنتم لا تعلمون.
So this question deals with a science that all of us should be aware of. All of us should know this broad science. It is called usul al-fiqh. And usul al-fiqh is the science of how we derive fiqh, how we extract laws, what are the sources of Islamic law, what are the terminologies, what are the language, rhetorics and devices that we use, and how do we reconcile between conflict or potential conflict between the sources itself. Most of the misunderstandings that occur about fiqh occur because people don't know the chapter of usul al-fiqh. One of my teachers used to complain all the time that one of the biggest disasters, he said, is that the majority of Muslims don't even know there's a science called usul al-fiqh, and so they open up the Quran and Hadith, and without any knowledge of how to derive, they just think they can extract the laws directly. No, there's a science of how you extract the laws. And the science of usul al-fiqh varies from school of law to school of law. As we are all aware, there are 4 famous schools of law, but there are many more besides these, but 4 that are codified and have an acceptance amongst the ummah. And usul al-fiqh varies between these 4. And it is one of the main causes why there are differences of opinion between these 4. So for example, the school of Imam Malik of Medina, they took one of the sources of Islamic law to be the practices of the people of Medina, for example. Right? So if the people of Medina were doing something, Imam Malik said, this means that their fathers did it and their grandfathers did it, and the Prophet ﷺ was alive when their grandfathers did it. So this means it becomes a source of law. So for Imam Malik, he had a principle that is called the Amal Ahl al-Madina. The customs of the people of Medina become a source of law for him. They become a part of the Maliki madhab. And the other 3 schools said, no, the people of Medina are no more special in the 3rd generation than the people of Basra and Kufa. And so we are not going to take this as a source of law. It is well known, Imam Abu Hanifa, he concentrated on qiyas or analogy more than the other 3 schools. So this led to differences in law. So the point being, the brother asked a question, what is the difference between fard and wajib? I wanted to begin by saying, this is chapter 1 of usul al-fiqh. If you open up any classical book of usul al-fiqh, the first or the second chapter, it is called al-ahkam al-taklifiyya, or the rulings that Allah has placed upon the mukallaf. Who is the mukallaf? The mukallaf is the one who is obliged to follow the laws of the sharia. So, an adult, sane male, female, an adult baligh, that is able to think rationally. So a child is not mukallaf. Somebody who's not rational, they don't have the intellect, they are, mentally challenged, they're not mukallaf. So the mukallaf is the one who is obliged by the sharia to follow Islamic law. And there are rulings on the mukallaf. All of the sharia can be categorized into these rulings. Now, we begin by stating, as we said, usul al-fiqh varies from school to school. So, the Hanafi school has a different categorization than the other 3 schools. And this is something that is general knowledge. I'm not going to go advanced today, but it is something you should be aware of, even as Muslims that are not specialized in fiqh, usul al-fiqh. This is general awareness. The Hanafi school has 7 primary categories, and the Maliki, Shafi'i and Hanbali school has 5 primary categories. Okay? This is something that we should all be aware of. Let's begin with the 5 so that we get a basis. Then the 7 we extrapolate. So, the Maliki, the Shafi'i and the Hanbali, generally speaking, they have 5 with some minor differences, but they all have these 5. And the highest category, so 2 categories deal with doing something, 2 categories deal with don't doing something, and 1 category deals with choice between doing or not doing. Okay? 2 categories, doing. Of the doing, you have the highest level, you must do it. And this is, according to the 3 madhabs, non-Hanafis, you call it fard or wajib. They are synonymous for the 3 madhabs. The 3 madhabs, fard or wajib or hatam or rukn or lazim, all of this is the same for them. And it is something that you are obliged to do. The technical definition, what the mukallaf is obliged to do and what he is sinful for not doing. This is the wajib or the fard. Standard example is the 5 salawat. This is fard or wajib. The second level of doing is sunnah or mustahab, and that is what you are rewarded to do and you are not sinful to not do. Okay, so the 2 rak'ah after dhuhr is sunnah. The 2 rak'ah after maghrib is sunnah. The 2 rak'ah after isha is sunnah. Okay, so this is sunnah. Then you have the 2 that you're not supposed to do. So the harshest is haram, as you know. And haram is that which is sinful to do. If you do it, you are sinful, unless it's a darura. Obviously, there's always exceptions. So for example, eating pork is sinful, it is haram. And then you have the one above that category, which is makruh, and the majority of the madhabs don't have a differentiation. They just say makruh. And makruh means if you do it, you do not get sin. But if you don't do it, and you had the opportunity to do it, if you don't do it, you will get reward by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's better not to do. But in case you did it, then Allah will not punish you for doing it. And then of course you have the middle category, which is mubah. Neither sinful nor is it rewarding. It is all permissible. And I'll give you an example of all 5 when it comes to the dress code, for example. So it is wajib for the male to cover his awrah. This is wajib. It is sunnah to go beyond the awrah. It's not wajib. It is sunnah. It is mustahab. You are rewarded. It is wajib to cover navel to knee. Now, should a man be walking around in public only navel to knee? It's not befitting. It is sunnah. It is mustahab. It is rewarding that he covers more than just the bare minimum awrah. Okay? It is mubah to wear shalwar kameez or thobe or pant shirt. All of it is exactly the same. And I have mentioned this in other categories and classes. There's no such thing as libas sunnah, as Ibn al-Qayyim and others say. All of it is mubah. As long as the awrah is covered and it is according to the requirements of the Sharia, it is all mubah. It is makruh to wear clothes that are calling attention to oneself, gaudy, ostentatious clothes. This is makruh. You're wearing something that is atypical and people will be looking at you as if it's a type of flaunting, right? This is makruh. And it is haram for a man to wear silk, for example, right? So these are 5 simple categories that I have given you. Now, one of the problems of this categorization that we need to explain to our youth, the problem is not in the categorization, it is we don't explain it, is that these are broad spectrums. Not all wajib is the same, and not all haram is the same. And unfortunately, we fail to communicate this to our next generation. So the term haram, for many of them, ceases to have its meaning when we put a large category of things in this box without explaining. Haram is a spectrum. It begins with a very small sin, it is still haram. And it goes all the way to shirk, which is the worst of all haram. When we tell our children, for example, that murder is haram, then we say music is haram, for example, right? For those who say it is haram. We'll have another long lecture about music one day, inshallah. But for those who say it is haram, our children are like murder, music, same category? How is that possible? And it's not the same category. And it's failure in our part to communicate to our children. Haram is a vast spectrum. You cannot just fail to communicate this, that there's something called sagha'ir, there's something called kaba'ir, there's something called akbarul kaba'ir, there's something called the 7 deadly sins. There's a huge spectrum. But for the sake of the sharia, the technical, you just say haram. Now, it is as if the Hanafis understood this. And they said, you can't just put all haram in the same. You can't put all wajib in the same. So the Hanafis divided the wajib and the haram, each of them, into 2 subcategories, thus making it 7. Okay? So from 5, they have 7. Because they wanted to convey that not all wajib is exactly the same. Not all haram is exactly the same. And so they actually have, in some ways, a more logical and rational categorization. I say this as a Hanbali. But In many ways, this categorization actually helps us to understand the goals of the Sharia. So the Hanafi said that let's look at what Allah has commanded us and realize that not all are at the same level. Some are very, very strongly binding on us, right? Let's call that fard. And some are binding but not to that level. Let's call that wajib. So for the Hanafis, fard and wajib are not synonymous. For the other three madhabs, fard and wajib are synonymous. They're the same thing. If a Shafi'i says fard and if a Shafi'i says wajib, he means the same thing. But if a Hanafi says fard versus Hanafi says wajib, they mean separate things. Now, what is the distinction between fard and wajib? Actually, for the Hanafis here, you might benefit a little bit. Actually, there is a controversy within the classical scholars of the madhab, even though the default and the beginning position which is taught at the beginner's level is that fard is that which is qat'iyyah dalala, and wajib doesn't have the same level of qat'iyyah dalala. Or in other words, fard is very explicit in the Quran and Sunnah, and to deny it might even be kufr or something. Whereas wajib is not as explicit in the Quran and Sunnah. This is the majority definition, especially the later Hanafi scholars hold this. So for example, they will say the 5 salawat are fard because Allah says so, and there's mutawatir hadith. As for witr, they say, the Quran is not explicit about witr. And the Sunnah doesn't have the same number of a hadith about witr. So it's not as binding, but it is still binding. So they put it in wajib. So they say witr salah is wajib, and the 5 daily salawat are fard. However, for the advanced Hanafis, they should know that this is one opinion, and others such as Al-Jassas has a much more, in my opinion, better. But again, I'm not a Hanafi, so it's up to you to decide which one you want to follow. But Al-Jassas, for example, he says that the fard is an essential part of it, such that if you don't do it, then essentially you cannot make up. But a wajib is not as essential, and if you don't do a wajib, for example, you can make it up. So he has a different way of putting it, but both definitions, or I should say 3 or 4, because the Ahnaf have other definitions, but there is a spectrum of opinion, but in the end of the day, fard is higher than wajib, however you define it. Fard is higher than wajib. So this is in the fard category. In the opposite category, what the other madhabs say haram, the Hanafis understood, you can't just say everything haram because that gives the wrong impression. Some things are not anywhere near as haram as other things. So they divided it. And they said that there is something that is called karaha tanzihi and karaha tahrimi. Okay? And so they had haram, then karaha tanzihi, then haram, karaha takrihi, karaha tanzihi, and then they have mubah. So they have 3 categorizations under that mubah rather than 2. And the difference between makruh tanzihi and makruh tahrimi. So what the majority said makruh, the Hanafi said makruh tanzihi. They called it makruh tanzihi. Then they have a category between makruh and haram from the other categories, from the 3 madhabs. Are you guys following, or am I going too fast? For the 3 madhabs, you have mubah, makruh, haram. Okay? For the Hanafis, mubah, makruh becomes makruh tanzihi. Then there's a new category. Then there's a haram. And the new category is called makruh tahrimi. Now, what is the difference between tahrimi, makruh tahrimi and haram? Again, goes back to technical difficulties, but technical definitions, but the essence is understood by all. Makruh tahrimi, the sin is not as big as haram. Okay? So, simple example. According to, and by the way, I've spoken to a lot of Hanafis about this, there seems to be some modern opinion, but the classical madhab did not allow people to eat shrimp, okay? And I've spoken to some major Hanafis, and they're wanting to rethink through this shrimpy position, right? This is not small fish anymore. We have to go be very, very deep fry about this issue. But anyway, okay, enough with the So our Hanafi expert here says he too follows the Jumhur position that allows shrimp. But the classical Hanafi position says that you should not eat shrimp. Okay? Now, are you going to equate shrimp with pork? Obviously the Hanafis did not do that. So eating pork is what category? Haram. According to the classical majority Hanafi position, eating shrimp is karaha tahrimi. according to the majority. But there's a new movement that's saying karaha tanzihi. I think they like the shrimp too much, right? So they're like upgrading. The shrimp gets a free upgrade. It's mubah, mashallah. He's given double upgrade, mashallah, tabarakallah. And for the majority of madhhabs, by the way, we'll talk about seafood one day, lecture about that, so they don't even think shrimp is anyway problematic anyway. The point being that you understand the Hanafis' 7 categorizations, and in fact, it makes actually more sense, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. As for the issue of sunnah mu'akkada and sunnah ghair mu'akkada, once again, this is something that all of the various madhabs have different terminologies for. And so the concept is found in all the madhabs, but the terminology is different. And so, for example, the Ahnaf have a whole advanced categorization. For the other madhabs, sunnah ghair mu'akkada can also be called nafil, for example. Right? So, all of these are terminologies that depends on the madhab of the scholar who uses them. Sunnah mu'akkada would be the sunnah that is strongly encouraged, that the Prophet ﷺ would habitually do. And the best example is the 10 or 12 raka'at that we pray after Fajr, before Fajr, before and after Dhuhr, after Maghrib, after Isha. This is sunnah mu'akkada. Okay? Sunnah ghair mu'akkada, for the Ahnaf would be, for example, Salat al-Ishraq, for example, right? The 4 rak'ah before Asr, for example. And the 4 rak'ah before Isha, for example, right? And the other madhabs will say this is nafil. So the point is, this is not something that would regularly be done, whereas the other 12 would be regularly done. So there's no there's no sin, I should say, because is it makruh to leave a sunnah? There's another usuli ikhtilaf, but there's no sin in the eyes of Allah if you leave a sunnah, but there is a sin if you leave a wajib or a fard. So this is the answer to this question, and I hope that inshallah it is clear that these categorizations differ from madhab to madhab.